Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, you can join our membership. You can go to preservelincoln.org to join. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J and L Lee Company, publisher of regional books as well as the Coinery. Jim has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim is on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission. He is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is a series of talks titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 30. These programs are videotaped and shown on LNK TV and also on YouTube. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
I think John mentioned that maybe we should very quickly redo the Lincoln Air Force Base, which is at the end of last time's program and may or may not have gotten caught, so we're not sure. I think we've seen all these, but we'll look quickly at Lincoln Air Force Base. The Lincoln Army Airfield was established in 1942, and by the end of World War II, they had trained over 25,000 aviation mechanics and 40,000 other troops for World War II. Reactivated in 1952 and modernized. This is a series of pictures which were a brochure which the Air Force put out. The officers' swimming pool. I'm not sure. This is the lake and the officers' clubhouse. Somebody said it had survived for a long time, but whether it's extant, I'm not sure.
It's not there.
It is not there now. The only building that I'm quite sure is the chapel, which we see here, which is now on the Register of National Important or National Historic Places. And this is the very last one, with the last B-47 leaving. 1966, 640 acres, which belonged to the federal government, and about 1,600 acres of land which belonged to the city of Lincoln were all converted to the city of Lincoln as a taxing authority. Lincoln area, which is almost all industrial now. But interestingly enough, a taxing authority which, to my knowledge, has never issued a tax, which is the best of all kinds. Huskerville, we did not talk about last time. Selmer Solheim will be partially responsible for this. He'll build 400 what are called wherry, W-H-E-R-R-Y houses. He'll build those on curvilinear streets, which we don't see here. Then Clark and Anderson will add another 600 units. By 1970, the Lincoln Airport or Air Force Authority is formed to take over all of this stuff. And the entire area in 1971 is renamed Arnold Heights. Half of the houses were intended to be sold after the city took them over. The other half became rentals. Strictly speaking, the north half of the area is known as Huskerville. The central section is Arnold Heights, and the newer southern section is called Oak Hills, privately developed. In 1943, the old chapel was put on the register. Some of these buildings came into the city of Lincoln. A few of them were put onto the University of Nebraska campus in the area directly to the north of Love Library, where they became known as Temporary A, Temporary B, and so forth, used as troops came back and went to the University of Nebraska. They also got scattered around the city of Lincoln, in some cases converted to two-story apartment houses. And as far as I know, literally all of those conversions to apartments have now been torn down, almost all gone. Hard to see why this has anything at all to do with the university or with the air base. This was the northeast corner of Cotner Boulevard in O, which is where I grew up. And it was built in 1927, canvas overboard drive-in, which sold only one thing, fruit drinks for a nickel. You had to go up to the window and get your fruit drink and bring it back to the car. None of you remember because it lasted probably only a matter of a few months before it promptly burned to the ground. But it is important because it is the northeast corner of Cotner and O. And as I said, it was put up in 1927 when the Cotner Boulevard was paved between the Havelock pavement and O Street. So this was the first thing that went up. A few other things will go up as well. But what we're going to talk about basically is what ends up there. This picture is taken a little bit later on. You can see on the right-hand side the sort of lines which are semicircular, which are a planned but never developed DriveIn Theater. And if you look up towards the top and a little bit towards the center, you'll see the Starview Outdoor Theater, which actually was developed. The large sort of white area to the left of the other DriveIn Theater is where we'll have later Robert Hall Clothing, the Lincoln Public Schools buildings, and so forth. So interestingly, this is what's going on before there. And then in the 1950s in downtown Lincoln, Bankers Life Insurance Company, which we have talked about previously, and their location there, was badly outgrown, had badly outgrown their building catty corner from the Bennett Martin Public Library. They felt that in order to build a new building, they needed about 2 square blocks of land. And to that end, a group of individuals began buying land between K and L streets. They're still empty, and Matt, that's where I think I understand that one of the square blocks is where the underground heating, cooling for the Capitol building is going. And people keep asking me, what are they doing digging that huge hole in the ground there? Well, that's one of the 2 blocks which were full of huge houses primarily. They were bought by private individuals and businesses in order to entice Bankers Life to stay downtown. There was a large faction that was encouraging them to stay downtown, an equally large faction which was encouraging them to move out where they could get more land than they needed, but control their neighbors as well. The people who were most vociferously in favor of them staying downtown were Joe Seacrest and a man by the name of Howard Wilson. The man who really wanted to move out of downtown was George Cook with Bankers Life. They hired then a man from Chicago by the name of Frank Chagru, who had a planning firm, and he suggested, as I did just a second ago, that they buy a lot of land, more than 2 square blocks, so that they could control their neighbors. They began looking at land at Cotner Boulevard and O. They first looked at the southwest corner of Cotner and O, which now has Freddy's. Used to have a telephone company store and a Salvation Army store, and then there's a mall in there. That area is the one they first looked at, but really didn't offer them enough property to be of interest. They also looked at land down around where the Hy-Vee and that unnamed bookstore are on O Street. Voldemorts, we call them there, whose name may not be mentioned aloud. And there, they ultimately did buy some land. It looked like that would be a good spot, but 2 more parcels were bought. That was called the Village Inn parcel. Then they bought 35 acres of land, primarily the northeast corner of Cotner and O Streets, through the several people that owned them. One of the major owners in there was Tony Domino, who owned the Italian Village, but the rest of it was picked up as farmland. They bought all of the land that surrounds and what we think of as Gateway today, with the exception of what was called the Conant property. The Conant property is in the extreme southeastern corner on O Street and 66th Street, where today we have McDonald's, the new post office, and those 2 sort of little shopping centers that go around them. That was known as the Conant property, and with the Conant property, there was also a small airport, private airport, which belonged to Harold Conant. That they did not buy. Later, it will become part of Gateway, sort of as Montgomery Ward. Remember Montgomery Wards? As Montgomery Wards is built, but not actually part of, but connected to Gateway. So separate but equal. So their idea was to build the shopping, or the primary Bankers Life Insurance Company property on the corner, and then later they will develop Gateway Shopping Center. 1959 is when things begin to get going. And it's interesting how we can see the grading for that original drive-in movie. They'd also put up the steel for the screen, and that's what got them into trouble, because after they had put up the steel for the screen, and this would be in the neighborhood of 1950, probably late 1940s, because of course this was a very fertile land for me to play around in, with this huge steel structure, and also 3 buildings which had basements had been constructed for the outdoor theater. But the federal government stepped in and pointed out to them that the steel they were using to build the screen had been condemned during World War II for the war use. Not condemned because there was anything wrong with it, but it had been set aside, and somehow or another they had gotten hold of this, so that whole project failed. Downtown merchants, of course, at this point in time were aghast. They predicted all sorts of things. We were inviting foreign merchants into Lincoln, and it would be the end of downtown. Well, in a way, maybe it was. A little bit later on, we can see now the tip of a wing to the right there. Almost dead in the middle, we can see Banker's Life has taken shape, as has the new Gateway Shopping Center. And if we look towards the bottom of the picture, we can see the Compleat properties, some of which are still there. And over to across the way, the quarter section of the Taylor section of land, which belonged to Earl Taylor. The Taylor property ran from A Street to O Street, roughly from 70th to 56th Street. 4 quarter sections and 4 parts of the Taylor family. The last one being sold and developed was known as Taylor Meadows. So the name comes there. That was the last one to develop. We can also see the Lincoln Public Schools building at this point in time as State Farm Insurance. It's fun to look at these aerial photographs and try and pick out where they are. Clear up at the upper right-hand top, you can see the Starview Theater property, and surrounded by farmland still. A little bit later on, we're looking, and we can now see Miller and Payne has been built. We're adding other features around the shopping center, Cotner Boulevard running left and right at the top of the picture. So we're looking towards the northwest. A much clearer picture looking towards the northeast. Banker's Life. Now we can see the construction of Montgomery wards and some of the other parts of the shopping center. And then the last part will be built, of a major part, will be to connect Gateway Shopping Center to Montgomery wards and some of the other buildings so that it does become a unified shopping center. What's going to happen now is an interesting question, because of course as Montgomery wards leaves, part of that is filled in. But as Sears and Roebuck leaves, it'll be interesting to see how that's filled in as well. Okay, moving right along. The Queen Incubator Company started in 1903. Was sometimes called the Pinkerton Manufacturing Company, sometimes the Hastings Manufacturing Company, and sometimes the Queen Incubator Company. They were first and very briefly manufactured in Hastings, and Hastings is known as the Queen City, hence the name Queen Incubators. We do not think of incubators at all anymore, but these were, and my grandfather had one, or I wouldn't know much about them either. They were almost looked like furniture. They were made usually of a very high quality hard wood. They were usually on legs like a table. They were in all sorts of different configurations. My grandfather's was probably 36 inches by 30 inches, and it had drawers in it, and each of these drawers would have little slots where the eggs would go. And then there was, in his, they varied, but his had what looked like a kerosene lamp. And the kerosene lamp was literally a kerosene burner, which furnished the heat to incubate the eggs. So this is what they were, incubating eggs. They were so successful that they almost immediately moved from Hastings to 14th and Y, and most originally of the boxes they were manufacturing were made of redwood, so an endangered species right off the bat. 1906, they had gotten so large that they had a separate institution which belonged to them in Los Angeles. Then in 1915, they reorganized as the Queen Incubator and Stove Repair Company, which must have been something they just tacked on. Also in 1915, they discontinued their mail order business and also stopped selling poultry feeds. But this is an attempt not to streamline things to make more money. It was that they were growing so fast that they couldn't keep up with the demand. By 1923, they were issuing a 1,000-page catalog. They had incubators alone, which would treat 70 to 360 eggs. And the smallest one, the 70, sold for $8. Every farmer had to have one of these, so my grandfather had one. 1923, their sales totaled 38,000 incubators at a retail price of $750,000. That would be probably close to $75 million today. Can't tell you exactly because money doesn't come straight through time very well. Their factory was 73,000 square feet. They had 16 salesmen out on the road, 9,000 retail stores in the United States, 130 employees in this building, and large enough facilities that they had their own railroad siding. So quite large. And in 1931, they were bankrupt, as things were going. At that point in time, in 1931, they were noted as one of Lincoln's largest manufacturers. All of the land which they sat on is now owned by the University of Nebraska. This is the A Street power plant, and we'll be talking about two different. We review the power plant in a minute when we start talking about the K Street plant. But in general, in 1884, the first commercial electric power was generated in the city of Lincoln, and within a very short period of time, they had 45 miles of electric wires, almost all in the downtown area. They were producing almost entirely direct current. Direct current would be primarily used for running like elevators. Eileen, could you give me a glass, or Wayne, give me a glass of water? Thank you. So the downtown department stores and downtown businesses were large users of direct current. Elevators today, and I'm looking at Matt, I think this is still true, elevators today still use direct current for the most part, but we very rarely will see direct current used for electric lighting or anything that we were going to think of it. But at that time, we did have some direct current electrical lighting as well. In 1904, a vote was made to build a municipal power plant and to sink a well called a Mocket well on A Street. Now, what Mocket meant in terms of a well, I've never been able to adequately figure out, but there was a guy who worked for the city in that department whose name was Mocket. So I'm thinking maybe that the Mocket well had nothing to do with the equipment or anything that was used there, but rather for Mr. Mocket, who was the head of the department. In 1905, the city water department purchased a tract of land, 40 acres in what was known as the Sager tract, S-A-G-E-R. It ran from A Street to D Street, from 27th Street to 30th Street. So it would be across the street from the Sunken Gardens and in the area which we now think of as having the Children's Zoo. Thank you very much. Thank you. And this is the first building which was built on that site. $13,500 was used to sink the wells which they would use. 1915, they began producing electricity at the A Street station. And this was at a time when the Lincoln Traction Company was still manufacturing electricity in downtown Lincoln for merchants and other businesses downtown. 1922, we will build the K Street plant. This is the building which today is, I believe, called the Waterworks, and it is an apartment complex. This is back downtown again. By 1872, the first gas production came into the city of Lincoln, and this would be the gas that would be put into wooden pipes, which would be transported to businesses and to some homes initially, even in 1872, primarily for lighting purposes. However, most of the power that was generated originally was for the use of the trolley system. The Lincoln Gas and Electric Company was formed and merged so that these companies are all becoming a little bit larger. In 1904, as I mentioned, the Mocket well is produced. And then in 1922, the K Street plant is produced. And it acquires ultimately the Lincoln Traction Company property, which is on the same site. 1932, the PWA issues bonds for public power plants. 1939, another company is formed called Consumers public power district. And the Consumers was a distributor of excess electricity that was produced by the city and other producers of electricity. So they would come together and sell this property, which brought to the city of Lincoln a very interesting and unusual system where there were in many neighborhoods, including the one I live in today, where there were two separate electric systems, two separate wires to all of the neighborhood. They would run up and down the alleys. Some of the houses were connected to one, some of them to the other. And it is not so much true today. It's slowly being gone, and I don't know how soon it'll be before it's totally gone. But clear up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, if the electric lights in our neighborhood go out, my neighbor directly across the street would still have lights. Or conversely, his would go out, everybody else would still have lights. Leftover from that time when Lincoln had two separate and competing, and sometimes using the same production facilities for electricity. Very interesting. 1962, the Sheldon Atomic Power Plant was built at Hallam. It didn't operate very long as an atomic plant, but in 1962, Lincoln's electric rates were the 9th lowest in the United States. So we're doing a very good job of producing it inexpensively. 1999, LES put two wind turbines near the Lincoln dump way out on Highway 77 north of the city. And in 1999, very briefly, the blink of an eye, they noted that Lincoln was the largest producer of energy in the state of Nebraska. Didn't last very long, but it's worth something you can advertise, I guess. This is the building now, which has been slowly converted away from the production of electricity. Right now, it is still being used by the State Historical Society, the state of Nebraska, and counties to store records. However, in the process of moving all of those records out of there, the city of Lincoln, in hoping then to turn this into tax-producing real estate. In other words, it'll be apartments on the upper floors and retail on the ground floor. If retail on the ground floor ever works. Interior. Okay. This building is one which, if you've driven by it, you can see up at the top, and not in this picture, but you look today, you'll see up in the parapet, it says Lord. Not a church building, it's the Lord building. It's on the northwest corner of O Street. 1910, a man by the name of Charles Lord opened an automobile distributorship at 1200 P Street. He sold 3 different brands of automobiles. Basically, unlike today where you might have General Motors, he had 3 different brands of anything he could get to sell. For a while, he was selling the Rio chain drive car, which was a 34 horsepower engine, and the 40 horsepower Premier, and it retailed for $2,800. He also sold the Franklin, which you may have at least heard of, which is an air-cooled car, which sold for $1,800 to $3,000, which he called classy, quiet, and powerful. So automobile dealers were selling whatever brand they could get. They weren't tied to any one of them. 1917, he moved to 230 North 12th Street and began selling the Hudson automobile and the Saxon automobile. Then in 1910, he will build this building in 2 sections on the northwest corner of 17th and O Street. However, he did not build it for his automobile company. He built it for the Geislinger Baking Company. However, the baking company never occupied the building. Instead, it became the Card Adams Overland Motor Company. Card and Adams became associated in a lot of businesses around the city of Lincoln, including the Savings and Loan Institution, which is across the street from Bennett Martin Public Library to the east. In the 1920s, Lord then moved into this building and put apartments on the 2nd floor. Then in 1927, still in the same building, he sold the Hudson and the Essex automobile, and later forsook them for the Graham Page. At that point in time, Mr. Lord moved to a new house at 3035 Sheridan, and it must have been a pretty good sized house because he named it, called Sheridorn, at a time when usually if you'd name a house, it was because you had quite a bit of land around it. 1936, interestingly, Charles Lord died in a motor accident. 1940, the Graham Page assets were sold to the Kaiser Fraser Company, and the Lord Motor Company dissolved. In 1941, this building became the Omar Baker Company. Primarily, it was used for distribution of bakery goods, not for baking things. Then in 1960s, the Omar man, went out of business, and instead it became the Krieger Glass Company on the corner. And they were there for several decades, which is how I remember the building originally. And since that time, since Krieger has been gone, it has been a bewildering maze of semi and unsuccessful bars, but there have been other little businesses on the ground floor, bicycle rentals, restaurant supplies, and so forth. They've done okay. However, I think if you're interested, you could probably buy this building right. The building just directly to the east just sold, which was a motor company too, and also it was Western Auto for a long time, and then it was where I had my car repaired, Economy Performance. And that building is now being converted to condominiums, apartments, and retail on the ground floor. Western Supply Company. The building doesn't look quite this good today. This is down in what I would call the start of the South Haymarket. In 1874, there were 3 small houses on this property, which is the northeast corner of 8th and N Streets. So to the right of it would be a tiny building and a parking lot, but you'll see that in just a second. So there were 3 small houses where this property is, and 1 large property, a large house, right on the corner. And it's hard for us today to realize that originally, even where we call the historic Haymarket District, which is now all buildings that have been converted from distribution of groceries and candy manufacturing and so forth, that area was all covered with little houses and little grocery stores and businesses until the railroad arrived in 1870, wiped it all out. So the fact that there are houses on the south side of Oak Street, not the least bit surprisingly, and they lasted a little bit longer than the north side. On the corner behind the big house, towards the north, on the alley, was another building which had been built, concrete and stone building, which was used to store Pabst beer, so a beer warehouse. In 1895, another business was started in Lincoln, primarily at the Lincoln Penitentiary, by a man by the name of W.A. Selleck. Yes, the same Selleck, the same family who will later be bankers at 12th and O. Also the business manager of the University of Nebraska, W.A. Selleck. All the same family. But W.A. Selleck, who was an attorney, along with a man by the name of John Horton and an R.H. Rathburn, started another company. And they were primarily, as I said, located at the penitentiary because they were using penitentiary inmates as labor, very, very common at this point in time. And they could hire them very inexpensively, but it kept the boys busy and trained them as well in some craft. 1895, they will build this building at 820 N Street, so on the north side of N, not quite on the corner. On the corner property, there will be a parking lot to this date. Originally, there will be temporary buildings in there attached to this building, but they will be gone shortly. They sold all sorts of plumbing supplies. In 1899 alone, they sold over 1,200 windmills, for example. By 1900, their sales had exceeded $150,000. They had 14 employees in the building. By 1923, they were calling themselves the oldest wholesale plumbing business in the city of Lincoln. 1965, Western Supply Company, still under the same name, built a new building, 42,000 square feet, down near Havelock in that area. And this building, 820, became used for storage for Restaurant Supply House, and also storage of a savings and loan that owned the building for a while. And in the 2000s, it was bought by AJC Investments, who are in the process of figuring out how to bring it back to some sort of semblance of a business. I don't know whether they plan on putting condominiums, apartments on the upper floor and retail on the ground floor, but it seems like a logical step. The building doesn't look this good today. Most of the windows have been brick infilled. The little dock on the front is torn off, and it's a pretty homely building, but the bones are there. Ideal grocery store. In 1910, a man by the name of Gardner Moore is working in a grocery store, the Miller's Brothers grocery store, at 301 South 11th. And downtown Lincoln was riddled with grocery stores at that point in time. He worked several places at other grocery stores as well. He worked for Nebraska Materials Company, and he also worked for H.P. Law, who was a wholesale grocery firm at that time, one of many that were in the city of Lincoln. Then in 1920, he visited a man for dinner one night by the name of Vidlock. And Mr. Vidlock owned a grocery store roughly on the southwest corner of 27th and Randolph. That's a parking lot today. When I was a kid, there was a a drugstore in there, and the building went towards the south up to the alley. But as it got closer to the alley, it was a separate business, and that's where Vidlock's grocery store was, north of the alley, but still on that quarter block. He offered Mr. Vidlock, Gardner Moore did, $2,500 for the grocery store, and in order to show his confidence, he put up $50 cash to buy it. It then became, and he was successful in buying it, Moore and Myers, a grocery store. Arthur Myers became his partner briefly, and they hired Mr. Vidlock to manage the meat department. Then they bought out Mr. Vidlock, and then Mr. Moore ultimately bought out Mr. Myers. Then in 1928, they will move across the alley, just across the alley to the south. And today that's where you have Paramount Laundry is in there pretty much. And when I was a kid, there was a locker plant in there as well. So that's where they'll move first. When they moved over, they had an agreement with the people who owned the first store just to the north of the alley that they would not put in another grocery store to compete with them. So what they put in was Piggly Wiggly, which evidently they didn't have a very good attorney, or they would have been in better shape. Piggly Wiggly did not work, but nonetheless, it was there for a while. At that point in time, a young man had just graduated from high school in Fairbury, and his name was Lyle Hans. And Lyle went to work for Mr. Moore, and they opened a second grocery store at that point in time on the southwest corner of 27th and R. And that became Ideal North, if you will. Then they opened a third grocery store in Lincoln in the old Governor's Mansion, which later would become part of the Lincoln Country Club. And Gardner Moore would tell the story. In fact, Lyle told me the story later on, as they operated that grocery store down at 7th and Washington, which, as I said, was later the Country Club's clubhouse. They operated the grocery store off the front porch, which had been enclosed. And behind them, a man from Shenandoah, Iowa, had come to the city council and had gotten permission to open a satellite radio station in the city of Lincoln, which was KMA. So in the house, the governor's mansion, which had been turned into a grocery store, and the KMA studios, they had a studio, and there was only one employee at KMA, and Lyle said that he was everything. They would not do all of their broadcasting from there, but they did satellite broadcasting from here. Shenandoah remained the main part. But as they operated that radio station, the one person became the engineer, the radio engineer. And Lyle said if he had to go to the restroom, Lyle would go back and watch the radio station, and in exchange, they would get free advertising on KMA. It didn't last too long. Then they opened their next store at 9th and O Streets in what we probably think of today as Knickerbocker's, which is, of course, gone now. This is the site of, at some point in time, it will probably become one hotel or two hotels and retail on the ground floor. That seems like the way to go. If we didn't see the sign up there, this is Ideal Grocery, we might not know it. 1930, they opened another store at 11th and B Streets. It was a pretty small store. But of course, the Great Depression interfered immediately. Then in 1938, so the Depression is now a thing of the past. In about 1938, they will buy the empty lots and houses which sit south of where their store is. They will tear down the houses, and then H.P. Law will finance the construction of the original Ideal Grocery Store. And if you can remember Ideal Grocery, its original building would have been approximately half the size that you remember it as. They would have added on, as I clearly remember, to the north and increased the store probably by 25%, and then also they'd added on little appurtenances to the west. It had read as one store across 27th Street as they added on. But when they built the building there, H.P. Law financed it, and in order to pay H.P. Law back, they gave him 1% of all sales. And it didn't apparently take too long because H.P. Law was pretty well paid off within a few years. And can you think back to what that building would have looked like? Roughly half the size across 27th Street of the store that you may remember was there. That was, when it was completed, around 1940, the largest grocery store in the state of Nebraska. The only grocery store in the state of Nebraska to have its own parking lot associated with it, and which they advertised in the newspaper advertisements, oceans of parking. Which, of course, if you remember later on, it wasn't enough to even park the employees then. At that time also, Mr. Moore issued limited partnerships to 4 people who worked for him, Lyle Hans and 4 others. By 1995, he had issued a total of 12 limited partnerships. So his store was owned by him, but he had these limited partners as well. And in 2012, Gardner is gone, his son Jack is gone, and the store is sold to Leon's, who takes it over. May 19th, 2016, at 2:11 in the morning, a 4-alarm fire completely destroyed the building. And you can see here, this would have been looking primarily at the half of the building, but you remember it, I suspicion. For years, the last thing I talked about was the original school in the city of Lincoln, the original school building. And I'm going to read some quotes which talk about the original school. So we'll try and get this into your brain where it was just from these quotes. Its address would have been 320 or 322 North 11th Street and Block 27. Probably means nothing to you. But here's the first quote. On the block, bounded by Q and R, 11th and 12th. A short distance north of the southwest corner was the stone schoolhouse. That's the end of the quote. This was the first school building in the city of Lincoln. Now in this picture, we're looking towards the north. The building in the immediate foreground is the stone schoolhouse. This picture would be probably taken in the 1890s. Okay, now another quote, backing up a little. Shortly after the seminary's building. Now the seminary was the building that sat between 9th and 10th O and P. No, excuse me, I'm sorry. The seminary building was the building that stood where today the Lincoln Journal building stands today, the seminary building. It burned in the spring of 1867. The spring of 1867 was before the city of Lincoln existed. This would have been the city of Lancaster. So the quote again, shortly after the seminary's burning in the spring of 1867, another building was constructed at 11th and Q. This one accommodated 35 students. So again, we're talking about that building in the foreground, aren't we? The Old Stone School in 1873 fittingly became the city of Lincoln's first jail. An interesting segue. So this picture about 1895. In this picture, we're looking from the university campus, looking towards the south, We're looking down 11th Street, and the building immediately on the left-hand side is the School of Music building, which would be where Kimball Recital Hall sits today. So we're looking down what used to be a street, but now it would be a pedestrian way between Kimball and the Music building. If you look at the first building beside and to the south of the School of Music, you can see two chimneys on it. That is the old stone school. It's still there. The larger building directly behind it, 3 stories tall, is the Windsor Hotel, which will become the site of the Q Place parking garage, ultimately. This kind of gets you to associate it with it. In 1928, the house, which then is directly to the south of the Old Stone School, will be torn down, and it will be rebuilt as the Salvation Army building, which runs up to the corner and attaches to the Old Stone School, which by that point in time has become an apartment house, but attached to the Salvation Army building. This is the building as I remember it. These are pictures I took probably in the early 1960s or late 1950s. This is the Old Stone School. The Old Stone School in 1867, which would accommodate 35 students, was, according to the newspaper, quote, tasty and substantial. Whatever the heck that means, I don't know. But tasty and substantial. Built by a man by the name of Milt Langdon, who was a carpenter in the area and built several other buildings. It was ready for occupancy by November the 25th of 1867. So by the time it was occupied, Lincoln would have been the name of the city, not Lancaster. They had a dinner to support the school just before it opened, and they netted $85 at this dinner. The first principal was a man by the name of George Park, and as I said, in 1873 became the city jail. This is we're looking towards the east in this picture. So the alley would be on the left-hand side. This is inside the Salvation Army building. Probably this would be in the late 1960s as we're getting ready to tear down that half of the block. Looking towards the stage or towards the north, behind that would have been the apartment building. This is the basement of the original stone school building. I always loved old stone foundations, and this was about the time where one of the few times that the guy threatened my life if I didn't get out of the building. Turned out I was able to talk my way out of it, but I was in the basement of this building without permission, and the Salvation Army was cleaning it out preparatory to its being torn down. It's being torn down to build the Lead Center. And there it goes. This is the last vestige of the last building from the city of Lancaster, per se. And here we're looking, well, you can see the Hilton Hotel. We're looking over towards the southwest here in this picture. So not much left of it. And this is the last picture. It filled with water, ultimately, and we were seeing the early construction of parts of the Lead Center. John Gregory. John Gregory was a man of many firsts in the city of Lincoln. He was a member of the Michigan Bar in 1860, so he came as an attorney. He served in the Civil War. He was a U.S. mail agent. He had lots of things going for him. But as mail agent, he got free pass on all the railroads. So in the 1862 era, he had heard rumors and stories about the Great West and thought that he should see them for himself. So using his free passes, he traveled on various railroads, including the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, which he took to St. Joseph, Missouri. Then he took a stagecoach to Plattsmouth. Then he rented a horse in Weeping Water, and he rode that horse to the city of Lincoln. He followed an old Indian trail. This Indian trail would have been which pretty much went through Elmwood along O Street and connected to the city of Lincoln. There were a lot of Indian trails. That's probably the one he would have traveled on. He got to Lincoln in 1862 September, where he said most of the area was covered with herds of antelope by day and coyotes by night, an area where no one lived or ever had lived. He slept one night with some Pawnee Indians on Oak Creek, where he found J. Sterling Morton's abandoned cabin, which was at the Salt Flats. And he said the area was as smooth and as level as any waxen floor, covered with salt 1/4 of an inch thick and white as the driven snow. He went back to Weeping Water and for $8,000 bought a team of oxen, some wagon equipment, came back to what would later be the Salt Flats and set up one of the early Salt Flats here. At the basin, he lived in a dugout, which instead of a roof had hay and sod as a roof, and a log fireplace at the back. This would be probably, we can't tell exactly where it was, but probably about where Oak Lake sits today and is divided by the interstate which runs out to the airport, in that area someplace. Probably he would have been on the banks of then Salt Creek, which has been moved and straightened, but it's in the same area. By 1863, he said that he was manufacturing salt at about $12 a ton and selling it for between $40 and $60 a ton, almost exclusively to wagons heading west. Then in 1863, he applied for permission to build a post office in the area, which was the first post office in this entire area, which he named Gregory's Basin. And his idea was that his name would then be associated with the city which would undoubtedly grow up forever. Well, that didn't work too well. Well, this was probably, this post office, as I said, would be closer to the city of West Lincoln than it would be to Lincoln today. By being the postmaster, he became a federal employee, for which he got $3 a year as a salary. Then he got an additional $12 a year for carrying the mail into what was then Clay County and its capital city, Claytonia, which still exists. And then 1863, also Gregory was elected to a 3-year term as county commissioner. Then he was also elected to the territorial legislature. And at that time when he was elected, the total number of votes cast in the election was 55. And we don't know how many he got, but he was elected at any rate. And in fact, at that point of time, as county chairman or county commission chairman, the first taxes were levied in the county of Lancaster. 1.5 mills on the grand value of this entire area, so not too much. Well, he and then another man by the name of Milt Langdon were the only attorneys in the area. These guys were attorneys in name, but probably not great attorneys. Milt Langdon, his house was directly across the street west from, again, the Lincoln Journal property. His milk house became the first jail in the city of Lincoln. But you got to remember, as these guys were the first of this and the first of that, as Mr. Gregory pointed out, everybody who wanted to be anything got to be it because there wasn't anybody. So naturally, you were the first of anything you wanted to be. 1864, our friend John Cadman out in Yankee Hill will set the wheels in motion to dissolve Clay County. Clay County, at that time, think of Lancaster as a rectangle above Gage, which is a rectangle. But if you think of those two rectangular counties, 3 as 3 square counties, the square in the middle was Clay County. And he began at that point in time putting the machinery in motion to dissolve old Clay County, giving the north half to Lancaster County, the south half to Gage County. And at that time, he ultimately is going to be able to do that. And Gregory, our friend here, also originally opposed this plan, but later he thought it was a pretty good idea. Gregory also convinced the state of Nebraska to issue $500, which would be used to build a bridge over Salt Creek. But Mr. Cadman was able to lobby to get half of that money, $250, so that 2 bridges were ultimately built over Salt Creek, one on O Street and one at Yankee Hill. Then in 1866, Gregory turned the postmaster job over to his successor, sold his claim in the Salt Flats to the Nebraska Salt Company, and became one of the first 6 members to form First Congregational Church in the city of Lincoln. He was elected the prosecuting attorney for the county, and he was also the first man in the county to be elected to the bar. He also established the first real estate company in the city of Lincoln. As I said, when you're the first and there are only a handful of people, you get to be anything he wanted. He moved to a larger house at that point in time at 1746 K, and had his offices at 10th and O Streets. But in 1891, Mr. Gregory, first of many things in the city of Lincoln, moved to Galveston, Texas, began practicing law there, went into the real estate business, and in short order owned 20,000 acres of land in Texas. In 1892, he was admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. And as I said, truly a first among many and many offices in the city of Lincoln. But as he said, remember, there were only 11 voters in the county when he first got here. He died in 1913 in Galveston, Texas. Next, we want to talk about 2 buildings, and I don't know whether we'll start and we'll see how we do it. There are 2 different buildings we're going to talk about. Obviously, this building is still standing, and we know it pretty well. In 1871, a man by the name of Harvey Hardy, who was going to be Hardy Furniture Company and also the city of Lincoln's mayor, opened a furniture store at 800 O Street, corner of 8th and O. His store was an immediate success, and he started moving. He moved very frequently, sometimes more than once in a year. Twice he was elected the mayor of the city of Lincoln, once on a very strong pro-temperance ticket. The last store move he made in Lincoln was to a double storefront at 1314 O Street, which is still there. It's been converted and covered and converted and covered, and now is apartments and condominiums on the upper floor. And those 6 minutes went by in a hurry. And yeah, in the alley, believe it or not, there are retail businesses. I don't know how well they're doing. In the meantime, Tilton and Phelps Furniture Company had started in 1905 at 1124 N Street. And as their business began to fail, in 1923, the Hardy Furniture Company picked it up and bought it. In 1920, a 3-story masonry building, and we're out of sequence here. I'm going to have to look ahead a little bit, because this is the building we want to talk about first, really. And we'll come back to the other one. But this is the first building which the furniture company will build after Hardy's built it. But this building is, in fact, not built by Hardy originally, but by the Lincoln Hide and Fur Company, which had a little tiny building around the corner on the same block. This was owned by William and Charles Cadwallader. And if you were in the city of Lincoln when I was a boy many years ago, you would remember the Cadwallader Fur Company, and this was the same company, just sort of changed through the years. Well, they will actually build the first portion of this building, the 3 floors at the bottom. And also in the same building, not only was the Cadwallader Hide and Fur Company, but also Thomas Perkins Kennard's Western Paint and Glass Company. Thomas Perkins Kennard's house is the one which stands catty-corner from the Capitol building. He was the first Secretary of State of Nebraska. He had formed Western Paint and Glass Company in 1890. So when Lincoln Furniture moved out, he then was able to take over the whole building, and he added the floors on top at a cost of $40,000. Then, at that point, we'll come back to this building, which is going to be built by H.E. Seidels. And I think last time, but maybe the time before that, we talked about the H.E. Seidels building, which was 6 stories tall, but much, much smaller, on what is the site today of the Stewart building. Only we don't call it that anymore, I suppose. I don't know what it is now. What do we call it? University Towers, right. There was an interesting building with lots of ownership changes, a floor at a time within it. And we'll have to call on you to explain that story next. And I think we'll probably stop here and really I'm going to make a note, and we'll pick this up and rehash this one next time. pick up two buildings which both become related and both used by Western Electric before they take on new ownerships as they have today. So at that point in time, we've got a couple minutes left to see if there are any questions. Yeah.
Did any of the wooden gas pipelines catch on fire?
The question was, did the wooden gas mains catch on fire? To my knowledge, never. The last wooden gas pipes that I know of that were used in the city of Lincoln when I was in the University of Nebraska, so it would have been in the period 1958 to 1963, they tore up 9th Street and put new pipes up to the K Street power plant. And one of the things they uncovered on 9th Street when in that excavation was wooden gas pipes still in use. This sounds potentially dangerous, but you have to remember that gas carries very little pressure. What is it? Just a few pounds per square inch, isn't it? And we'll finish this up. I'm getting the sign that I would love to talk about the wooden gas pipes, but they were in use up until that period of time. And I'm getting the sign that we're completely out of time. So we'll be back next month, is that right? Hopefully by then my voice will be completely recovered and no one will have to bring me gin. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you.